Hi, everybody. Welcome to the April 2020 Open Hour. Such a difficult time in the world to be convening. So I really appreciate everyone's time and ability to be here today. The topic of this open hour is law and community science, and we're really fortunate to have four great speakers with us. Adam, Tony, Rye, and Chris. And I'll pass it over to Adam to start a round of intros. Thanks.
Thank you. Excited to be part of this. My name is Adam Stollerow. I'm an attorney with a boutique environmental law firm in New York City called Cy, Padgett and Rizal. I met Liz last year when we were putting together a citizen science panel for the New York State Bar Association meeting. So happy to be continuing the conversation.
Great. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you. Tony Wilkin-Gibbard. I'm Executive Director of Midwest Environmental Advocates. We're a public interest environmental law firm based in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm happy to be here today.
And my name is Rye Carpenter. I'm the Community Services Coordinator / paralegal at the same firm as Tony, Midwest Environmental Advocates in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I am Chris Nidell. I'm a private attorney. I have my own firm. We have 3 lawyers in Washington, D.C., and we do environmental work, typically more on the civil side, civil personal injury, so toxic tort, property damage, nuisance cases, but generally with an environmental focus.
Great. Thanks so much. Now we'll go back to the top of the list, Adam, to share the content you prepared for this call. Take it away.
Sure. One of the things I work on a lot at my job is environmental review of projects. My firm does a mix of assisting project applicants and government agencies with their role in the review, and also with project opponents who are trying to slow down or stop a project or make sure that it has the proper environmental review when it's not getting it. So for anybody who's not familiar, I'll just give a quick overview of what the environmental review process looks like. So environmental review happens at a federal level under the National Environmental Policy Act. There are lots of state laws. In New York, it's the State Environmental Quality Review Act, and there are, I think, state equivalents basically in every state, where if you have a project that's getting government funding or approval, there will be some review of the environmental impacts of the project. And the bigger the project, the more likely it is it's going to go through the full version of that review. It's typically an environmental impact statement gets developed. That process of environmental review offers a couple of interesting opportunities for community collected data or citizen science at a couple places during the process. And actually during that, during one of these cases that I was working on was the first time that I got really excited about the potential use of community collected data. And that case involved a project that was happening in an environmentally sensitive area. It was a big expansion of a medical facility that was going from like 18,000 square feet to 140,000 square feet. We had looked at a bunch of different potential environmental impacts associated with that project. And one of the things that had come out during the review was that there hadn't been a proper review of endangered species at the property. There had been a very cursory look. Like the project developer had written a letter to the state agency, the state environmental agency, asking for them to check their database and make sure that there weren't environmental endangered or threatened species in the database. And they got a form letter back that said that there wasn't anything in the database. But it turns out that in the federal database, there were 2 different species of endangered or threatened bats that may have been located near the property. At that point in the process, we were, so one of the things that can happen during the environmental review process is that instead of doing an environmental impact statement, the agency will issue what's called in New York a negative declaration, meaning you don't have to do a full-blown environmental impact statement. There's an equivalent on the federal level called a categorical exclusion, where you're determining that you don't have to go further in the process, or you reach the end of the environmental assessment process and say you don't have to do a full study. So we had sort of gotten to that level, and we were trying to find new angles to keep the environmental review open and to make sure that they had looked at everything that they were supposed to look at, and trying to prepare for litigation in which we could challenge the approvals of the project. So there was no chance at this point that the agency that was in charge was going to make the project developer go back out and do additional studies of bats. But we had a client who bought an off-the-shelf tool called I believe it's called an echo meter. It's this basically a thing that you can attach to your phone or your tablet, and it allows you to take recordings of bats. If you walk around, the time of dusk when bats are coming out, you can actually record the sounds that they're making as they fly through the air, and the software that's that you get when there's an app that comes with the little recording device, and it'll give you a first guess at what type of species you're listening to. So my client was very gung-ho about this and went out on her property line and recorded like nights and nights and nights of bats out there. And it turned out that some of those samples showed the northern long-eared bat and the Indiana bat were the two bats that we were concerned about. And the samples actually showed that those bats might be on the property. It didn't end up in our case leading to a reopening of the study, but it did show how tools like that could be useful, not to definitively prove that there were bats on the property or what kind of habitat those bats were using. Those are the sort of expert level questions that that you would need a wildlife biologist to weigh in on. But what we were trying to do is generate enough data that the agency couldn't ignore the potential presence of those bats by triggering additional study. So that case is still in litigation, but that was one example of how, citizens on the ground could use a pretty cheap, I think it was like $100 device, maybe $150, some relatively cheap device to go out and record at times of the day when it would be prohibitively expensive for somebody to pay an expert to be out, night after night trying to get recordings of bats. I'll save my answer to the question about how, one thing I wished that citizens knew about this, but I do want to sort of highlight the different role. I mean, I did a little bit, but the different role that that experts play versus the community in that situation. So we were trying to leverage the community's knowledge that there were, number one, there were tons of bats flying around, that they were around actually later in the season than what they typically were. If you just went to the state website about those bats, it would tell you that they start hibernating in October, but we were making recordings into November. So we were able to leverage, interested community members to be able to collect data that then we hoped the experts, so like experts couldn't really substitute for that on the ground knowledge and the on the ground effort. But also if you flip it, the people who were on the ground couldn't use the data that they were collecting to definitively say that there was a bat or that, endangered bats were on the property. We were trying to use the environmental review process to trigger that next level of review. So that's I think that that's just one example. You could think of all kinds of different examples, whether it's water monitoring to establish a baseline. In these environmental reviews, it's helpful, I think, to have people get involved early in the process and to understand where you are in the process of review. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Adam. All right, I'd like to pass it over to Tony to share. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Liz, and thanks for having me on the call. So as I said, Midwest Environmental Advocates is a public interest environmental law firm. We're based in Madison, Wisconsin. And I'm newer to the organization, so I have not practiced environmental law. We have 4 attorneys on staff who litigate cases and work with citizens who call our agency for help. So I don't have as much practical experience as Chris or Adam, but I just wanted to share a little bit about our organization and the issue that we are confronting right now. One way that we identify situations in the state of Wisconsin where we feel like we need to be involved with more scrutiny and potential litigation is through our helpline. So we put ourselves out there to the state of Wisconsin as a public interest environmental law firm for the people of the state. And so we receive calls and requests for assistance from individuals who may have the sophistication that they're collecting data about potential violations, or may just feel that there's something amiss and they need help understanding whether environmental laws are being enforced or whether there's a potential violation. So our team works with those individuals when they call our organization. We really feel that there is going to be an increasing role for community collected data and individuals monitoring potential violations, especially over the next several months, as the regulatory apparatus is at reduced capacity with everything else that is at reduced capacity in the context of quarantines. So in Wisconsin, Governor Tony Evers issued basically a stay-at-home order a couple of weeks ago, and so all of our state government is also at reduced capacity. As folks I'm sure saw back on March 26th, EPA issued an order saying that they were suspending some ongoing monitoring and compliance. And what that means in most places really devolves to the states and state agencies. And so we've been in contact with our state Department of Natural Resources and are working with them right now to understand exactly what their capacity is to monitor violations and how they will be granting exceptions or exemptions to the regulated community. And so I think that really calls for community engagement and citizen engagement. This is all evolving, but we expect that we will be asking community members across the state of Wisconsin to pay attention to what they're seeing, and either providing that information directly to the Department of Natural Resource or contacting us so that we can kind of triage information and help the DNR understand where it can deploy its very, very limited resources in this time. One area that we've historically had a focus on at Midwest Environmental Advocates is industrialized agriculture and CAFOs and mitigating the harm that comes from those facilities. Actually, one of my colleagues, Adam Voskel, just joined us, and he works with our egg program. He leads up that work. And so that's one area in particular where we often get information and data from folks in the community who are concerned about those facilities. And it's something that we are putting an increased focus on. especially in the context of climate change. So in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest, our precipitation patterns are clearly changing over the last several years, where we're experiencing winters that are warmer and wetter, and we're experiencing more extreme rain events. And so that just exacerbates the water pollution implications and issues that come from industrialized agriculture. And it's doing so in ways that kind of the traditional regulatory apparatus can't keep up, where we're seeing our DNR not able to get a handle on exactly what's happening in Wisconsin. And so one thing that we are doing to encourage folks to collect data and try to make that more streamlined is developing an app that will allow people to gather information about CAFOs and whether and collect data about possible violations. So actually, Adam, if you want to just say a little bit about that, since you're on the call, you could speak to it better than I could, and then we'll kind of wrap up our portion of the conversation.
Just to make sure everyone can hear me, right? Awesome. All right, so we have partnered with an organization called Coding for Good, and we're working to develop kind of this on-the-ground, community-driven monitoring and I guess monitoring app, for lack of a better term at this point, which allows citizens to kind of open an app and take a picture of the particular violation that they're seeing. One of the interesting things is in the area of these CAFOs, the citizens on the ground really have kind of the best grasp of what the restrictions are, what fields might be in compliance and which fields may not be in compliance. So we really do rely on them for the most part in determining whether a violation has occurred or not. And so this app allows them to take a picture and describe the violation that they may be seeing, and then choose from a drop-down menu of at least the traditional violations, whether it be spreading on frozen or snow-covered ground, or spreading during a rainfall event, or on a field that may potentially be above its nutrient threshold. And from that point, then that information goes to our servers, which will then take both the data from the picture, so like GPS coordinates, as well as the potential violation, date and time, and the picture itself, and we'll kind of aggregate all of that and allow us to either forward that information onto DNR in terms of kind of pushing them for some type of compliance or enforcement action. Otherwise, at least keeping track of who the bad actors are and potential ongoing violations. So it's really this idea that because we can't be everywhere, and the communities themselves, especially over the last decade or so, MEA has really worked to build that capacity to develop an understanding from the citizens in the area that have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis, that they're actually the best equipped to be able to pass that information along. And then we'll, from that point, aggregate it and work with them to develop some type of resolution to that from that violation, whether it be, again, just seeing DNR go through an action, or whether we pursue it ourselves. But it's been a 6 to 8 month process so far, and we're still working on them. We're hoping to get a beta version out sometime, and then work from that to develop a final product. And then obviously one of our concerns was this idea that it could be spammed by potential bad actors or something. So it's at least at the initial point, it's going to be kind of this sign up only, just to make sure that all the data that we're getting is really something that we can use. But depending on how some of those pilot projects go, we'll figure out how to kind of provide it to the broader community.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah.
Great. Tony, were you going to add more?
We'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Then Rye, were you going to add in anything in this section?
I don't know. I don't have anything to add. Tony and Adam summed up that work quite well. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks. So over to you, Chris.
Okay. So I'm happy to be here. It's always good to have a chance to speak to people, also to meet some of the other folks that are doing a lot of interesting things, as well as some of the same things that I'm trying to do. That app idea, I would love to talk to you guys about that. That's something that I've been working on. I think Jeff at Public Lab and I have talked about that in the past before. So you guys, I'd like to get in touch. But anyway, as far as what I want to share with the group today on the call, sorry, my dog just joined me and he can be fairly distracting. But you know, a lot of the stuff that I do is mostly litigation based. So the goal of data in my world is ultimately to get it admitted into the court. And as most people that have experience with that, you know, that can be a challenge. And one of the things that I confront in that context is that a lot of times people who don't have the resources to get an expert out, as people were talking about, you know, in the middle of the night, or to get an expert out, period. What ends up happening is the cost of experts, the cost of lab data ends up being prohibitive to the point that they don't even explore what's going on, right? So they end up just getting dumped on in one form or another, and they just feel they have no recourse because they've heard that it's, you know, you have to have EPA certified this, that, and the other expert with PhDs and all these degrees. And so, you know, they end up being stopped in their tracks because they feel like they can't achieve anything that would help them fight what it is that they're being exposed to, or what they're, you know, what's impacting their community. And so with that, what I would like to share with the group is, you know, what courts are tuned into, and the same thing is true to some extent with administrative bodies and review boards, but what they're looking for is the reliability of the data, right? So one of the ways the courts look to the reliability of the data is to see, is there a fit for its intended purpose, right? So if your purpose is to establish that there's a bat of a certain type that may be impacted by your development, then maybe an app that has a certain precision and specificity would be sufficient. And so, you know, we have things in my context. I think the bat example is a really good one, where you can buy a $100 tool and you can get some useful data, right? It may not be to the degree of, you know, selling a pedigree of bats, but it's sufficient to say that there may be a concern that we're overlooking that we've missed, right? And so what I would say is that if you're looking at the purpose of your data, if you're in a community that's got an impact, or you have a concern about development, or about the impact from CAFOs or some other impact, there are three ways to look at the purpose, as I see it, at least in my practice. One is to identify the problem. The next would be to define the problem. And then the final one would be to go into court and establish or prove the problem, right? And so a lot of times you can use citizen science within those first two categories, and sometimes even to the third category of proof, but you can use citizen science to gather a wealth of data that may not be, you know, the top dollar data with super precision and reliability, but it shows you where in the community the problem's most prevalent, right? So where the water's most impacted, is it upstream, is it downstream? You could do that by doing simple tests, sometimes with, you know, temperature even, right? So if you have a power plant that might be dumping into the river, you can find that the temperature downstream is obviously a lot warmer than the temperature upstream. So even something simple as, you know, using a thermometer of the most basic nature, but then you can do, you know, tests for total dissolved solids, which are pretty simple, you know, meters that you can buy for a few $100s and test the water in a stream, say if you're looking at fracking, for example. So there are lots of things that you can use that may not require, you know, an expert.
Chris, you went mute.
Hold on one second. Did anyone else
I encourage
have Chris's
communities
sound
to
drop
do.
off? Okay, great. I'm sorry, Chris, to interrupt. We lost your sound after you said
Wow.
that. So the last thing I got for the notes is that that total dissolved solid meters can be bought for a few $100s, and
Okay.
then you broke out. Thanks for rewinding.
Okay, that's odd. Okay, so you have meters like total dissolved solids, a meter like a temperature meter. You have photographs, right? And one of the most basic forms of data capture that the other folks were talking about. And these can be done with citizens themselves, and they can be done cheaply. They don't require an expert, and they don't require expensive labs and everything else. But what they can provide is they can provide a step toward that that ultimate proof, right? So if you find out that you really want to look upstream rather than downstream, or you want to look downstream of where there's a pipe coming out of, you don't know where, but you know that when you go downstream, the temperature changes, or the color of the water changes, or the total dissolved solids in the water change. That's where you want to spend your money, right? So maybe at that point, you then have an expert that you pay, or let's say you don't have an expert that you pay, but you have someone. I had a case against a CAFO, and I've talked about this with Public Lab in the past, but I had a case against a CAFO where we had just the local water keeper, who was not a PhD in anything, wasn't trained in science, had taken an EPA webinar on water sampling, and she took 15, 20 samples, which were then sent to a lab under the prescribed protocol.
Hey guys.
To take these samples. And that's a good example, I think, of where you can build on citizen science to the point that ultimately you get something that you can then use and prove in court. And I think when you go into a community, or when I interface with the community, and I would encourage other lawyers when they interface with these communities, that you don't need to start with what seems like an insurmountable burden of trying to prove what's going to be reliable in court, right? You can do odor surveys and see, when do people smell a certain smell? They describe the smell. They only smell it at night. I have a community that I'm working with out in Oregon right now, where, and I went out there, and when I stood out in a park across the street from the plant, it was a sunny day. I stood there within, a couple, 100 yards of the plant, and I was sitting there saying to myself, well, gee whiz, what's so bad about this neighborhood? And we went back to the exact same spot at night, and at 10 o'clock at night, it was like a chemical blanket. It was horrible. You went from your car to your house, and you could barely breathe in between. And just the accumulation of those, what some would say, anecdotal reports of, here's the odor that we smell. I mean, in fact, something that's probably the most interesting aspect of that whole thing in Oregon is the way I found out about the problem was that someone had reported that they had 2 or 3 dogs get the same cancer. So I started talking to them about what might be in their environment. And she said, well, we smell a mothball smell. When I walk my dogs early in the morning, I smell mothballs. And I looked on the map, and one of the first things I saw was a wood treatment facility. Am I back?
Hey, you did. We just said that from the neighbor who smelled mothballs, and I think you said there was a wood treatment facility, and then.
Okay, yeah. So all I did, I don't know why, I don't know if it's just me or if it's Zoom, but anyway, so I looked on the map and I see her neighborhood, and I see this wood treatment facility, and mothballs, I just happen to know from my experience are the smell of creosote. And so, you see this, she's smelling mothballs. There's a huge wood treatment facility there, which is emitting lots of creosote, which smells like mothballs. And so you have this whole community that all of them, when you talk to them, are saying, yeah, we smell mothballs, and we usually smell it at night, that are documenting or serving to start the documenting of this exposure to creosote, which is coming from this wood treatment plant, which is, contributing to lung disease and cancer in the community. So we've actually now gone out and taken some samples. So I worked with some of the people in the community to take some samples to send off to a lab. And then at some point we would eventually work with experts to go out and take the samples themselves, which we would then rely on for purposes of court. So you can kind of see how the data can build from really the most basic health surveys, odor surveys, and then some basic data gathering, even with, pH of the water, things like that, up through, us taking samples with untrained people to send off to a lab to sort of get the next level of data, then ultimately to try and get some experts in there to generate what we would like to ideally rely on for court. So I guess especially given the technical issues, I'll stop there. And if there are questions, maybe we can have some more discussion along those lines. But I think the important message that I have is that, you shouldn't, all data is reliable for some purpose, right? The question is, what's that purpose? And is your data reliable enough for that purpose? And so you really have to, start by gathering some data. And if you can build on that, you can figure out where to spend money, where you think you need to spend the money to really sort of get past that final burden, if it be an administrative hearing or to get it in front of a judge or a jury.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing this content. I have several questions on my mind, and I'm assuming other people here also do, so please make a note of those. Before we open this to questions, we're going to, all the speakers knew coming into this that we were going to have a round, and I'll put it here in chat. Whoops, not the letter V. But what is one thing you wish everyone who's about to collect data about their environmental concern knew in order for their data to have greater impact? And I'd love to go back to the top of our round and go through Adam, Tony, Adam CV. Okay, Rye, and then Chris. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks. And I think Chris did a really nice job setting up the issue, and saying that all data is suitable for some purpose, right? It just depends on what level of proof you're trying to get to. And my example with the bats was, I couldn't go into court and use those recordings that my client made to prove that the bats were there. But what I could use it for was to show it to the agency and say, hey, you really should be looking at whether there are bats on the property, how they're using the property. That you should require the developer to get someone out there with the expertise to look at this issue. And if you don't, when we get to court, I'm going to try and show that it was, arbitrary and capricious for you, or not reasonable for you to deny that request. And that's a much easier burden to demonstrate than to walk into court and say, look, the bats were definitely there because we made these measurements. So there is a gap between, taking the data and showing that the bats are there and that the project would have an impact on the bats. But in between there's a step where you can show that the agency's decision wasn't reasonable because there was this data that it ignored when it shouldn't have. The thing that I wanted to pass on in terms of what I wish community members knew, and I think that it helps, especially if there isn't a lawyer involved at the early stages of project opposition, when there might not be, when you just have people in the community know that there's a project that's happening or some sort of problem, and the lawyers aren't engaged yet. If there's a permitting process, I think it's important to just try and understand where in the process things are, and it's not necessarily the easiest thing to figure out, but in environmental review, in the process that I was talking about, there's a stage called scoping, and then there's a public comment stage, and those are both two very important parts of the process to be involved in. But I think for community members, part of it is knowing when your data can be effective, because if you collect it too late, the process might be closed already. I'm just talking about environmental review and permitting, but the timing is important. So it might be worth just engaging with a lawyer to understand where in the process you are, and understanding what data might be helpful at that stage in the process, or where it will be, if you're engaged early in the process, the question might be, well, when do we submit this data to the lead agency or the government in order for it to have the most impact.
So I guess what I would add is, and it ties in with what Adam was just saying, is that community members, citizens, when they're taking that step to collect data, to not do so in isolation. So to understand what grassroots community groups or nonprofit organizations might also be engaged on the issue, and to reach out to those organizations so that they can collect the right kind of data, or they can collect data that is suitable for a purpose that's part of a larger strategy. So organizations like ours that can fulfill exactly what Adam was just saying, not necessarily represent someone throughout a permitting process, but at least provide that little bit of legal information and context so they understand what is happening and what information might be relevant and when. If I had to boil it down, it would be to not do so in isolation, to do so as part of a larger group or movement, and to understand that information gathering as part of a larger strategy that extends beyond just any one concerned individual.
All right, I can go, which kind of builds on that, and just something I've been thinking about as a lot of this, some of the citizen data that comes out, we find ties into work done by other universities or scientifically related individuals, is to kind of, while understanding not to do the work in isolation, but it's also to maybe do that preliminary legwork and see how their specific type of monitoring could tie in or reflect kind of this broader historical knowledge that a lot of these water bodies, particularly in our area, are being studied. So to try to tie it into other studies, I guess, would be something that I would boil it down to.
So I guess what I would answer that question with is, at MEA, one of my duties is managing our citizen helpline. And just prior to citizens gathering data, knowing their rights, like what agencies to talk to, as Tony and MEA Adam mentioned, knowing who to contact, whether it be other organizations that do similar work, and other groups of that nature. Just knowing who to contact and knowing that you're not alone is a really powerful way to collect data. Thanks.
Great, over to you, Chris.
Okay. All of these are great suggestions. I think there's some common theme as far as looking out for a network and trying to see what other folks have done rather than to try and reinvent the wheel. I think the thing that I would say to communities, and maybe it's a little bit comes from, sort of how I come to these issues, but what I would say is there's not a magic bullet as far as data goes, right? So I've had cases where the defendants have challenged EPA's data, right? So you can have EPA gathering data with their own trained personnel, with certified labs and certified methods, and still that data is going to get challenged by, whether it's Walmart who wants to build there, or whether it's, ExxonMobil who wants to continue polluting the community. So these defendants will always challenge anything that suggests that they're having an impact or doing anything wrong or making people sick. So, starting with that in mind, then you have to be smart about your data, right? So when we had the waterkeeper pull water samples that were looking for primarily for nutrients and for bacteria, one of the things that she did was she wore rubber gloves and used sterile technique. Rubber gloves and sterile techniques not going to really help you if you're looking for benzene, but if you're looking for bacteria and your hands are dirty, that's obviously going to affect the reliability of those samples for that purpose. right, to show that there's bacteria. So what I think you need to do is realize that there's nothing that you can do one way or the other that's going to perfect your data, right? So you have to educate yourself as to what the nature of the data is that you're looking for, what the ultimate purpose of that would be, and then within your means, try to find a way to get the most reliable set of data. And one of the ways to do that is to educate yourself, and the other is to document everything that you're doing. And you know, a lot of times data in that most simple form, for example, the odor logs, like we talked about, just the process of starting to formalize documentation of that, right, and doing it within your community, that can be very powerful. And ultimately, you know, I mean, it can be powerful for persuasion, and it can ultimately be powerful in front of a jury or a court, or it can be something that an expert then later relies on and says, well, I have these data results, these sample results that show me high levels, but I also have corroborating that I have a bunch of homeowners within the community that are all saying they're smelling the same thing at the same time at night, right? So my biggest message, I guess, is not to be daunted by what you hear as far as cost and expense. Look for those smart tools. You know, the citizen science tools are growing, becoming much more accessible every day. When we see air monitors that you can buy for $100, $150 to check PM or VOCs. So these types of things are out there. They're getting more and more accessible, and we should be arming our communities and educating them how to use them and take advantage of them, so that we can, you know, frankly become, you know, industry's worst nightmare.
Yes, thank you. Becoming industry's worst nightmare is entering into the notes. Great. We have come 3/4 way through our call, and now we have time to take some questions. I see some community members here, Sairam, Jesse, longtime public labbers, Jeff and Shannon. And I'd like to know, does anyone have a question for anyone here?
I have one. So earlier an app was mentioned for reporting environmental violations. And I'm kind of curious about, so when you have things in a digital realm like that, it knocks out certain people as being able to participate, having access to the materials or being able to use the digital interfaces. Do you think that courts perceive app-generated data as a higher value than data generated in more traditional ways?
I can try to answer that, although I would definitely be happy to have other people jump in as well. I think personally, for me, I'm hoping that it becomes a lot more valuable in terms of providing information to the regulators. But I wouldn't say particularly that the courts would find it any more or less valuable. And we'd be, you know, we take any way that we can receive that data as important. This was just one way to potentially try to knock down some of the barriers to getting that information to us, so people aren't taking pictures and then emailing them, or just, but I in terms of value for the court, no, probably I don't see it as something more valuable there.
So I would add to that a few things. Number one, I mean, one thing that the app does is that it provides some amount of a chain of custody, right? So if someone is taking a picture with their phone and that picture is being geocoded, or, you know, GPS coordinates are being put on there, and it's being uploaded, there's not a way to, you know, the question about where that photo was taken or what time it was taken become, for the most part, they're resolved by the data stamp on that photo. So I think app-based data can have some additional reliability that, you know, relying on someone who took a picture that might have stored it on their computer, might have had the ability to Photoshop or doctor that photo. and obviously would need to be there to some extent to testify to where they took it and what time they took it. So I think the app can get past some of those reliability hurdles a little bit more so than just traditional, photo-based or without the app. The other thing that I would add, and this has not been talked about with respect to this app, but this is something I'd like to see with apps, is that a lot of times the data is not shared. So one community, if I'm thinking about fracking in the hills or the mountains of Pennsylvania, and somebody smells an odor on one side of the hill, they don't realize that a bunch of their neighbors on the other side of the mountain are smelling the same thing, and it's always happening at midnight. And what I would like to see through the potential of these apps is that that data gets shared in a way that encourages and builds on the evidence that show that there are these problems. One of the good examples that I think of are health-based data. So, the fact that you have 3 kids with cancer on one block, the fact that you go 2 blocks over and you have another 3 kids with cancer, those kind of data are not regularly talked about. And in fact, when states and health departments come in and do those investigations, they tend to keep the data private. But if there was a way to log that data in a more public fashion, obviously through people's own choice, but so that you can see that I'm not the only one that has this concern, there are other people in my community that have these concerns. I think that goes to the power of these kind of shared data systems like you can do through apps.
Great, thanks. Anyone want to jump in on this question, or should we take another question? Great. Anyone here have a question before I start? I was really interested to hear Adam's story, Adam S's story on bringing in data to the agencies so that they later can't say that they didn't know. That's a story we've heard in the public lab community before. Scott Eustace, who was on previously on this topic, and when Chris was as well, he had a big success with that. And I wonder, could you share any more about how citizens can help agencies do their jobs against political pressure coming from, outside of their agency or from the top down in their agency?
Sure. I think one thing is to check out what the agency is asking for on its own website or its own outreach programs. A lot of times where agencies have identified a need for helping hands from citizens, they'll say so, or they'll develop a program to help get that information in the door. So one of those things for New York State is and Liz, we heard this at our panel last year, is in citizen water quality monitoring, right? So they have dedicated programs to train citizens to get out there and test water quality, or to have days where citizens are helping to do fish counts and things like that. So I think agencies are getting more sophisticated or more engaged with asking the community for help, and that might be a good first point of entry, where agencies are feeling like they could help, or that community engagement could help them do their work. A lot of times they'll set up a program or ask directly for it.
Great. I can't resist adding a part 2. We have some community members in rural Pennsylvania who have really been struggling because their state Department of Environmental Protection just will not do any regulation of agriculture for air quality impacts. Like it's like not allowed, like by state law for this agency to do that. And like, is there any way, I know there's not a lot of specifics in my anecdote here, but what would be, if there's any ways forward you could see, I'd love to hear them. Anybody?
Well, this is Chris. I don't know when, if and when the video switches, but so it's interesting. I should talk with you. I mean, I litigated some of the agricultural air quality cases in Pennsylvania, and probably led to, not through my own choice, but my involvement, some of the bad law. I mean, basically, there's a Right to Farm Act in Pennsylvania that says that there's not much you can do to farmers, which is probably what the state is using as the basis for not doing much. But there are some exceptions to that, and what we all know about Pennsylvania is that it's the first state to put their hand up to take anyone's waste. And so a lot of what's happening under the guise of agriculture is just waste disposal, with sewage sludge and other slaughterhouse waste and other things that are being used as quote unquote agricultural amendments that are just destroying, the quality of life and the well-being of people around these types of facilities. So, there are some exceptions, and the more you can document, actually the big exception is health effects. So the Right to Farm Act itself says there's nothing in this that prevents or that protects things that are impacting people's health. So to the extent that you can start to generate data on health, that becomes, a bit of a bit more of a challenge to those types of activities, and should get some response from the state. Although the state DEP in Pennsylvania is obviously pretty horrible. So anyway.
Chris, that seems like it seems like a pretty big loophole, especially for air impacts. And now that people are paying more attention to PM, I mean, it seems like you should be, that should allow people to get in there and do air quality sampling, even in a state like Pennsylvania.
Right. I mean, what and what we could discuss for the next, the rest of the day is, at what point have we proven that people are actually having health effects? But which is my world specifically. But yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, if you've got 10 kids that are having asthma attacks routinely in a small agricultural community, there's good argument there that there are health effects and that something needs to change.
Great, go for it, Stevie.
So some of the, a lot of what I'm taking away here from what people are saying is the opportunity that people have to go to regulators with concerns, which I greatly appreciate. But I think there are a number of situations and community groups that we've worked with who time and time again have gone to complain about these things without either seeing that agency show up to check in on it, or without sufficient response to that concern. And I guess I'm wondering, from your standpoint, at what point should people consider further legal action when they're not seeing agencies answer to concerns that they're having? And then what are steps that people should take when they're considering that move?
So I don't want to be accused of hogging the mic, but one of the things that I do, and it seems like it's a little bit different than some of the other attorneys that are on the call. I do mostly, I do civil suits, right? So when the agencies fail, that's where I come in, and not necessarily once they've failed, but where they are failing, right? So I would say that communities need to reach out. I mean, one of the things that I see that happens in communities, and other folks can chime in, as I'm sure they have experience with this too, is that people want to believe, despite the notion that everybody wants to sue someone, people generally want to believe that their state and local governments and these agencies are going to help them, right? And so they put their faith in they speak to them face to face, and those people tell them, look, we're looking into it, we're going to work on this, we're going to try and get them to do the right thing and whatever. And one of the problems with that is that a lot of times it doesn't happen, either through incompetence on the part of the state, through corruption on the part of the state, or just ignorance on the part of the state, or a combination of all of the above. And what can happen is that your time period for then taking other action, right, for filing a lawsuit, gets passed. And so a lot of times what these agencies, and certainly the companies, have in mind is that if we can just keep these people quiet for a year or 2 years or 3 years, then they won't be able to sue, and this will all go away, right? And so, I don't want to discourage people from going through the agency route and going through the administrative routes, but you need to be aware that your clock may be ticking on other avenues. And if those agencies fail you, you may or may not have an opportunity to talk to a lawyer like me, that could try to do something else to put pressure either on the agency or more often on the bad actor itself, right? So the CAFO or the polluter, whatever it is, and it's often too late that these communities realize we're not getting anywhere with the agency or with our local government folks, and now we need to do something, and it's been 4 years and all the evidence is gone or the time period's up and all these things. So it's important to pursue all of those aspects as early on as you can, because you may miss an opportunity.
Just anecdotally, one of the things that we're seeing in New York is on Clean Water Act suits, you have a community nonprofit that sues first and then goes through that process, right? You do a water test, you see that there's violations, or you look at Google Maps and you see that there are avenues for stormwater runoff off of a site into a water body, and you issue in New York, there are groups taking these things on, right? So you've got good partnerships between Riverkeeper and Waterkeeper and some of the law firms here, where they'll get the law firm on a contingency fee to issue an intent to sue under the Clean Water Act. And that can start often, at least, and I end up actually representing a lot of the clients who get these notice letters, right? So the small businesses that are near water bodies that may be polluting. And so when they come to my firm, we're at a point where we say, okay, well, we know, what you need to do is clean up your site. And, the likelihood is that this litigation is going to go away for attorney's fees because, the law firm that's taking it on needs to pay their attorneys. So, we understand that. But at the end of the day, we want people to do the right thing and get covered under the permitting schemes, and make sure that they have a stormwater pollution prevention plan in place and do the right thing. But sometimes it's, you start, rather than going through the agencies, if you're lucky enough to be in a place where there is an active system, where you have a Riverkeeper type organization and local relationships with attorneys, you can start out with a lawsuit, and then that begins the conversation with the regulator, or among the community and the entity that's polluting and the regulator.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Quite a way to make an introduction. You're like, well, let's start with a lawsuit and then have a conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. We've reached the top of the hour. Does anyone have any burning comments that need to be made now before we wrap April 2020's Open Hour? Okay, great. I see Chris gazing intently into the middle distance. I'm going to.
Oh, sorry. I don't know who can see what that I'm doing, but multitasking.
Great. Well, look, thanks everybody so much for sharing your expertise and experience on this issue. The public lab community is really, really hungry for information like this. And you've all, among the speakers, you've all been connected to each other. And for anyone on this call, I think you're all connected to the public lab staff. Please just reach out and we'll make connections as appropriate.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. Thanks for organizing.
Great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I'm happy to talk to anyone offline as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Great. Well, everyone, stay safe and help everyone support networks stay strong under these trials, and be in touch. Bye.
Yep. Thanks all. Take care.